Tonight, you're not reading a charter or tracing trade routes on a map. You're sitting in a small boat in the dark while a city full of spices closes its stalls for the night. Before you fall asleep, you'll drift across black water where lanterns float like low stars. Watch two merchants take on a cargo no customs officer must ever notice, and follow a saint whose journey under salted pork will reroute the pride of a republic. You'll hear how Venice borrowed a body to anchor its story, and how a single crate could tilt a city's idea of itself toward a different shore. Lanterns knock gently against hulls. Oars tap like a heartbeat under your feet. Somewhere along the quay, a spice stall shudders with a wooden sigh. Cinnamon dust settles, pepper cools, and the air remembers every ship that fed this market. Alexandria exhales into the harbor cardamom, fish, old prayers, new gossip, then folds itself into dusk as if drawing a curtain over the ledger for the day. Out beyond the last lamp, the water is just dark enough that one more boat can slip past without anyone agreeing to see it. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, perhaps the next ring of an oar against a hull will remember you there, half awake, while the lagoon and the Levant quietly trade a saint. Because this heist doesn't begin with galloping horses or shouted orders. It begins with two merchants, a crate, and a tide that knows how to keep the secret. You might not think two merchants, a crate, and the saint could reroute the pride of a maritime republic, but the tide is patient and very good at moving quiet cargo. Breathe in and hear the oars find their rhythm. Lanterns knock against boat ribs like soft metronomes. Alexandria folds itself into evening, and the markets finish counting. We begin where spices hang from rafters like little flags of cinnamon and star anise, and where fish sellers know more about wind than most admirals. The city hums. A sea breeze wanders through, fussy and salted, reorganizing smells into something like a catalog. Here's pepper, here's myrrh, here's lamp oil, here is yesterday's boat. A pilgrim stops to check his sandals, not because they need checking, but because doing something slow feels proper. Alexandria is good for slow. It has a way of laying out the day like a rug and asking you to find the pattern. Most people pretend to see one. Most rugs are forgiving. Somewhere behind the market, a church keeps a careful shrine. The name is Mark, the job description short. Preacher, companion to Peter, writer of a gospel, martyr. Sailors say he looks after people who leave shore on purpose. Merchants say he improves sales figures by an agreeable percentage. In the 820s, officials say things about him too, but they say them nervously because shrines attract attention, and attention attracts the kind of storms that do not check the forecast. In the corners of the church, frankincense softens brick into lullaby. Someone has polished the lampshades again. Someone always has. Venice, far to the northwest, notices with the steady curiosity of a city that has made noticing into a career. In the lagoon, every rumor eventually sits down and dries off. Traders bring home little news pellets. Alexandria is tense, they say. Authorities are tidying old temples with new enthusiasms. There are whispers about moving relics, redistributing prestige, balancing invisible books. None of this sounds particularly dramatic on a foggy morning, but it does sound like opportunity, which for Venetians is just drama without the hat. Two men listen more carefully than most. Their names, embroidered in trade ledgers in a tidy hand, are Bono of Malamocco and Rustico of Torcello. They know customs clerks by first name and by lunch order. They know how to fold a receipt so it looks like a blessing. They understand, as all great logisticians do, that the shortest distance between 2 points is sometimes a conversation. The Doge of Venice Justiniano, Participatia speaks to them exactly as long as a person speaks when the idea is both obvious and deniable. A relic worthy of Venice would be welcome. He says, the way rain is welcome after the roof is fixed. Alexandria, at dusk, puts a glaze on every surface. The harbor is a bronze bowl, lightly shaken. Buono and Rustico drift through crowds like a rumor 2 days old. Inside the church, they meet men who love the saint but love certainty more. Money is a kind of certainty. So is strategy. Wax is scraped from hinges in the way wax is always scraped from hinges, gently by someone who has practiced on less important doors. A lid lifts. A silence arrives that is less like reverence and more like arithmetic being checked twice. Mark's relics, which a city once guarded with processions and a stubbornly long memory, are suddenly part of a list on a notepad of the mind. Take the body, hide the scent, sail at first wind. The plan has all the elegance of a grocery list, and that is precisely why it works. Salted meat fills most crates in most ports. Inspectors expect salted meat. Inspectors have opinions about it. Meat will tell on you with smell, but it is also so busy being meat that it hides almost everything else. The body is laid on slabs of pork. Linen wraps what should not be seen. A board slides into place, then another. Nails tap a small and even hem. A priest murmurs a blessing that sounds comfortingly like a shipping rate. A stamp thumps. The crate becomes cargo, which is an excellent disguise in a city where cargo is scenery. Outside, the wind decides to hold its breath. Oars take the job instead, backs moving with the patient conformity of people who have learned that rhythm is cheaper than speed. A gull lands on the mast and rides, whose species has been up to this behavior since gulls discovered masts. Somewhere along the quay, a lamp hiccups, goes dark, then bright again. A small theatrical piece performed nightly for an audience of one clerk. On the tide, the boat clears the mouth of the harbor. Alexandria sighs and returns to counting. Merchants count things, even when they are not there. When dawn dilutes the horizon, the sea turns into library paper, off-white and gently lined by swells. The crate behaves like any crate. The pork behaves like pork. The sailors behave like men who know that history is easier to transport than to explain. The saints, one suspects, behave like people used to travel. There is no miracle in the logbook which lists water skins, spare oarlocks, and a new coil of rope. The miracle is elsewhere, in the part of a ledger where numbers rearrange into story. 4 in, 6 out, the breath says. The open sea makes small mouths of men, and the lagoon, hours or days, or however you measure hope later, will welcome them with familiar weeds and the home sound of marsh birds yelling opinions no one requested. In Venice, boats are stairs and streets, and sometimes phone calls, and always excuses to wave. The return in 828 is timed to bells and gossip. The crate passes from shore to hands that understand both commerce and choreography. Everything smells of brine, wood, and tobacco that is pretending not to be tobacco. The Doge greets a sealed future with the smile of someone who has done the math. A church official peers. The note in his head reads, "Erase the pork, keep the piety." This takes exactly as long as it takes to draw a line through an awkward number. Incense solves many problems in narrative and most of them in architecture. Smoke edits the air. The crate opens in a nave that has considered grandeur and chosen it. A hush performs its job without overacting. The relic is lifted into Venice's hands in a scene that would be lavish if it were not so tidy. Guilds step forward with banners, a portable rainbow. Pilgrims begin counting days the way bakers count loaves, one cooling on the rack while another goes into the oven. A temporary shrine rises like a stage set that decides to become a building. Soon, temporary notices the weatherproof sky and stays. San Marco, basilica and reliquary, is ordered by men for whom marble is a language and glass a memory aid. The facade practices being an allegory. Mosaics bloom where walls once had the modesty of plain brick. Venice writes its story into an alphabet of tesserae, lions' wings, gold that keeps the morning even when the morning leaves. There's no official caption that reads, "A relic equals legitimacy," yet everyone learns to read it anyway, the way you learn the slang of a city by walking around. The processions settle into a calendar. They move from the Doge's palace to the basilica and back, circles within circles, like a clock inside a clock. The lagoon reflects banners and occasionally corrects their spelling with ripples. Children invent a game that involves stepping on only the light stones in the pavement, claiming the dark ones belong to the sea. Priests practice the comfortable art of repetition. A sentence condenses from the mist of civic conversation. With Mark, Venice becomes a republic that prays as a fleet and sails as a choir. It is not carved anywhere, but if you stand in the piazza long enough, you will hear it implied by pigeons and shopkeepers alike. Building is a mood that suits Venetians. They lay out bricks as if they're playing a board game with time. They dress domes as though dressing for weather that might surprise them with sunshine. Rule of two becomes a stone proverb, build for twice the crowd, because tomorrow enjoys arriving early. St. Mark's grows not like a tree, but like an anecdote, conveniently at the points that make the telling good. Spirals appear. Arches lean on one another like friends at a railing. The winged lion, borrowed from the prophet's vision and settled into the city's seal, gazes at everything with an expression that says both do not and do. Sometimes buildings learn more than their builders intended. The basilica begins to keep Venice's memory in a disciplined way. It shelters relics and ceremonies and also breezes and the smell of morning pastries smuggled into late services. It keeps faint scratches on marble where a procession turned sharply and did not expect a step. It remembers the day a small boy dropped a wooden boat into the baptismal font and the bishop pretended not to see until after, when everyone was safe on the dry side of history. Centuries drift. Fires happen the way fires do, with speed, compelling case studies, and afterward, inventories. The first San Marco burns. It is the sort of loss that shakes dust free from policy. But Venice has already made a habit of rebuilding, which is a cousin to resilience but more talkative. In the smoke's echo, the story says the saint reveals where he has been resting, a hidden place indicated by a lifted slab, or by a certain angle of light, or by a mason who remembered the peculiar generosity of a particular brick. Accounts vary in a way that suggests a city solving a problem by telling it 3 different ways until everyone agrees they remember the same memory. Reinterment follows with seals pressed into warm wax, and with handwriting that knows this page might be read aloud later. Copyists copy, and the words pick up tiny variations like seashells pick up whirls. Translation becomes translatio, which becomes, eventually, a day off for some and a sweet pastry for others. The idea holds steady. Bodies move, holiness travels, contracts are improved by association. A saint becomes passport and contract witness, a signature written in bone. The notaries keep a straight face while the bells express things at volume. Treaties now enjoy introductory clauses where the lion nods discreetly from the margin. Ambassadors glance at mosaics as though checking exchange rates. Before fleets sail east, a blessing slides over decks like oil over hinge pins. Sailors pin little lions to their tunics, practical as safety pins and just as sharp. None of it guarantees good weather, but then few things do, and those that do are usually lying. What all these rights provide is something easier to store. Morale, which is to success what cinnamon is to bread. Not the point exactly, but difficult to imagine the point without it. Venice becomes expert at living with echoes. The basilica's glass remembers light so well that it glows in your head when you close your eyes. The story of the heist walks the city like a polite dog. Guides explain how pork cured piety, and visitors nod solemnly at the theological ingenuity of butcher shops. A favorite side remark claims that, thanks to this event, Venice essentially invented the category of religious logistics, which sounds like a graduate seminar but mostly involves good boxes and excellent timing. A boy who does not love sermons learns to love domes. A girl who prefers numbers becomes the best counter of steps between the palace and the west portal, and undertakes revisions whenever the crowd forces a detour. At night, the lagoon composes its own minutes. Oars fold. The saint whose bones once traveled beside salted meat and under a quiet sky sleeps behind glass that reflects stars as if they had come to visit. The city, more convinced than ever that identity is a canal you maintain, gathers itself in the piazza. Two pigeons argue over the theological value of breadcrumbs. Somewhere, a clerk writes the day's last line, pauses, and draws a small wing in the margin. He does this not out of superstition, but out of habit, which is stronger. Years add themselves like tiles. The basilica keeps a high, soft breath, even when empty. Schoolmasters escort small troops of children who are trying not to look impressed and failing. The lion stares down new hats with the same expression as old ones. A stonecutter teaches his apprentice that marble does not like to be hurried. A chorister practices a phrase that tastes faintly of salt. When the tide forgets itself and wanders into the square, boots make beaten tracks that look for all the world like calligraphy. People step around words they cannot read. Meanwhile, scholars say sensible things, that relic theft was not unique, that politics were a cassock and then a cape, that cities barter stories the way markets barter figs. All true. The restful part is how even the practical explanation becomes a lullaby when you repeat it slowly. Two merchants, a crate, a harbor, a basilica. The facts are modest and content to be so. They ask for small considerations, a little patience, a little incense, an ability to appreciate carpentry. We return to the water because Venice always does. Out by the bacino, boats take turns sailing past the mouth of the Grand Canal, like actors hitting the same mark in a long-running play. The sun rehearses its reflection and never misses a line. The basilica's bronze horses keep their steady and slightly distracted gaze, as if looking for a stable that keeps moving. Mark's symbol lion with book opens its book to a sentence no one reads aloud anymore, because the city knows it by heart. If you are still with me, we can breathe again, and slower this time. 4 in, 6 out. Think of Alexandria, and how dusk placed a velvet lid on the harbor. Think of a crate labeled with something ordinary, traveling with the certainty of things that smell like dinner. Think of a cathedral that learned to remember for everyone, very quietly. Nothing here insists, and nothing hurries. The oars make their neat parentheses on the lagoon. The bells know when to stop. We could keep listing details until morning, tile by tile, ripple by ripple, receipt by receipt, and the story would not end so much as continue like a procession that loops back into its starting place and rests there very gently as if the square itself were a pillow. You might not expect a piece of very polite rock to transform how people talk to each other, but a pencil is just graphite in a wooden coat, and it has been quietly conducting social life for centuries. Borrowdale in the north of England offered a vein so pure in the 16th century that shepherds thought dark clouds had fallen underground and stayed. They cut the stuff in neat rods, wrapped twine around the shiny sticks so fingers wouldn't turn moon-gray, and discovered that this crumbly mineral would obey even the gentlest pressure. Imagine writing with rain that learned to stand still. Letters flowed, lists multiplied. Mistakes, being human, also multiplied, and graphite forgave with a fast swipe of a sleeve. The oar had the soft authority of a librarian who whispers your name correctly on the first try. Somewhere between a scribe's quill and a carpenter's mark, the world developed a taste for lines that didn't scratch. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe out of sheer courtesy to the pencil, or you can let the idea rest on your nightstand like a stub with bite marks. Either way, no one from the Royal Mail will be involved. We'll just keep drifting like a shavings curl around the blade, slow and obedient, until the page is padded with little curls of detail and the mind dozes. Graphite is not actually lead, which is mildly disappointing if you were hoping for drama and metallurgy. The Romans had their stylus of real lead, which left pale tracks on wax the color of a sleepy candle. But Bordel's bounty was carbon soft, slick, and faithful. For a while, England guarded the mine as if it were the recipe for time. Black graphite was sawn into slats like chocolate bars and sold to Europe, where craftsmen bound it in sheepskin, tunneled it into hollow goose quills, or wedged it into cedar so the dust kept its place. The French, briefly cut off by war and weather, invented a composite: powdered graphite, a pinch of clay, heat like a summer that doesn't end. The clay was not for flavor, it gave the mix a backbone. More clay, harder line, less clay, softer, darker. The recipe never looked urgent, yet it tuned an instrument the eye could hum. That is how the HB scale was born. H for hard that behaves like a crisp winter step, B for black that behaves like a warm loaf, F for fine in the way a librarian says, good choice. Cedar became the favorite jacket, not because it was noble, but because it does not splinter and smells like a drawer that always finds its socks. Red cedar from the eastern forests of North America planed into obedient slats, grooves milled with the serenity of a metronome, each channel waiting for its graphite clay noodle. Warm glue, a second slat, pressure with a patience that can be measured in T. The hexagon arrived so the pencil would not roll off a desk at a decisive moment, such as when you wrote yes. Round ones are still made, mostly for children and optimists. The black dipped end was simply paint, but the mind decided it was weight, and people began holding pencils as though balance were moral. The yellow body, in vogue since the 19th century, claimed to honor exotic graphite from Siberia. In practice, it honored the way yellow refuses to sulk even when an eraser bites it. Erasers deserve their own whisper. In 1770, Joseph Priestley, who had a productive relationship with both oxygen and curiosity, noticed that rubber, then called India rubber as if it had walked here, was very good at putting graphite back into the realm of ideas. The material was sticky with memory. It held on to mistakes the way a pocket hangs onto lint. For decades, students kept crumbs of rubber in little packets, thumbing off errors that flew like gnats. Then the ferrule arrived, a tidy sleeve of brass or aluminum that held an eraser like a hat. Crimping machines pressed with small, decisive chews. The eraser blushed pink from pumice and dye, and suddenly errors had a home attached to their cause. Somewhere an exam improved by half a grade, and an entire nation of desk drawers adopted a faint smell you can still identify with your eyes closed. A pencil does not make a sound worth remembering, except the quick papery scratch sometimes compared to a cat trying to remember a door. That quiet is part of the charm. Quills were aristocrats that slurped ink and left their grief on cuffs. Steel nibs were clerks with opinions, but a pencil is a neighbor. It will stand outside your door, capping its foot, and when you open, it will help you move a sofa. When steel pens seized in cold weather, pencils shrugged and took notes. When fountain pens leaked like gossip, pencils absorbed the scandal, then underlined, "See me." Pencils went into space, not because of the myth that pens would not work, but because pencils are immune to zero gravity. Graphite floats only into ideas. Workshops learned to sharpen in ways that resembled philosophy. The pocket knife produced a decisive cone, fan of shavings peeling like an argument that becomes obvious only after you make it. The carpenter favored a long chisel point that shaded boards with certainty and would survive a pocket full of nails. Artists who consider edges to be personalities shaved long leads like quills, brushing them against sandpaper as if teaching a bow to sing. Somewhere, a child chewed the lacquer and learned with care that paint is not peppermint. Somewhere else, a shopkeeper licked a pencil by habit and left a gray kiss on his inventory. The pencil forgave both and continued the list. Factories developed choreography as soothing as any lullaby. In Nuremberg, in New Jersey, in Osaka, slats marched along belts, grooves catching their little cylindrical guests. A drum full of paint turned like honey thinking about bees. Printed labels flashed their family names: Eagle, Koh-i-Noor, Tumbo, Stuttler, Blackwing, each announcing not lightning, but a different mood of gray. Embossing wheels pressed gold leaf so thin you could read through it yesterday. Quality inspectors rolled finished sticks on a flat board and listened for wobble, as if the pencil could confess misalignment with a mild rattle. The best made a sound like silence. Boxes stacked, the weight polite, the corners square. Pencils leave factories like cadets who have thoroughly rehearsed posture. Schools adopted them the way schools adopt anything that behaves. Examination papers smiled faintly at no. 2 pencils middle of the HB family, neither too hard to sulk nor too soft to smear, Goldilocks of compliance. Scantrons preferred the conductivity of graphite, while pens sulked at the margins. Fill the bubble completely, the instruction says, which is the kind of life lesson a bubble is qualified to teach. A pencil shortens by cooperation. Each answer reduces it until you hold a considerate stub that has done its duty and would prefer to rest. Desk sharpeners hummed like small storms. From their black stomachs, curly shavings pressed themselves into coins of tree memory. If you ever pressed your thumb into a fresh shaving, you know that time can be soft. Accountants used them for columns that might change their minds. Writers pretended they needed them for first drafts, which is less about erasability than about the permission to be almost correct. Musicians discovering that batch is tolerant, but publishers are not, penciled bowings and breath marks like tender graffiti. Architects in the 20th century kept yardsticks of graphite in grades that sounded like a choir 2H. HB, B, 2B, 4B, as if the building would rise in the register it was drawn. The famous Blackwing 602 promised half the pressure, twice the speed, a claim so endearing that no one ever called it to testify. John Steinbeck demanded fresh points as often as a mood. Nabokov drafted on index cards with a point like a needle. Engineers drew machines with the same unassuming instrument a child used to assemble a spaceship from boxes. Modesty, as a design language, traveled well. The pencil had adventures in bureaucracy. During wartime, lists of boots, biscuits, and belts leaned on its particular gray. Telegraph offices made pencil marks beside messages that caused alarms to ring in other towns. Census forms met pencils the way oceans meet rain, briefly overwhelmed and then pleased. Votes were recorded by pencils with little caps on their heads like embarrassed mushrooms. Libraries, before barcodes learned to be civil, stamped due dates while a pencil added a cryptic sign that indicated something to the librarian and to no one else. If you have ever wondered why a certain marginal mark looks like a sideways fish, it is because someone's wrist taught it to swim there in 1952. We can leave our desk and follow the pencil as a traveler. Tailors carried chalk pencils that skated across wool with the temporary personality of frost. Mapmakers sharpened hard H leads that refused drama. Naturalists wrote plant Latin in notebooks that went hiking. Surveyors, untoppable optimists, carried pencils on lanyards because gravity likes a joke. Prison writers chose them because ink can be picky about security and time. Crew chiefs tucked them behind ears, as if the ear were a shelf designed by a considerate god. A pencil behind the ear means, I am ready to measure the world and adjust it slightly. It also means, I will forget it's there until I lie down. Then there is the matter of stubs. Human affection rarely attaches itself to perfection. It tends to find home in things that tried. A pencil near its end becomes a biography. Teeth marks, nicks, a label worn down to Wing 60, a ferrule shiny from thumb prayers. People make extenders that give stubs another month of work. It is like fitting a favorite book with a new spine and sending it back into a bag. When a pencil finally becomes a polite comma, it rests at the back of a drawer where small coins and paper clips gather like a quiet market. Every once in a while, a parent gives a stub to a child, the way you pass along a story that doesn't need a moral. In a museum, you might find pencils arranged like soldiers of a kingdom that never went to war. The labels will be careful: cedar, lacquer, graphite, clay, aluminum, pumice. Visitors will whisper as if the pencils could hear whether they are being admired or categorized. The eye will be attracted not by novelty, but by the comfort of repetition. Yellow repeats, hexagon repeats, eraser repeats. This is how the mind relaxes when it can predict the next corner and the corner complies. An old advertisement promises elevated speed, another promises noble lead, a third promises that the eraser will not harden in winter. They are all true enough in a gentle way. The pencil even has a small claim in the history of the envelope. When Rowland Hill's penny post asked senders to address things legibly, pencils obliged with a hand that never ran the way ink does when rain votes. Love letters were sometimes written first in pencil, then traced in ink, then crumpled either from passion or from the recognition that passion is easier to write than to post. Marginal notes in recipe books, the extra pinch of salt, the reminder that Aunt Ruth's oven is untrustworthy, remain graphite, even when the main text has drifted into printed elegance. Graphite stays. It fades with a courtesy that looks like respect. As for the international language of the carpenter's pencil, those flat red ones, its dialect includes marks like the crow's foot, the tick, the box line, each indicating cut here. Do not cut here. Cut here after tea. Its body refuses to roll because a roof beam's edge does not forgive. It sharpens with a pocket knife into a chisel that seems eager. If you ever hear a builder hold a pencil and say, "There," the word becomes a line the way a promise becomes a plan. Later, paint covers the pencil, and the line becomes a rumor embedded in a wall. Someone 40 years later will find it during renovation, smile at the steadiness of the old hand, and keep cutting. We should give a nod to mechanical pencils, the ones that click like small decisions. They are elevators for graphite, reasonable, economical, eager to please. Architects love them for their predictable line. Students love them for the way the lead travels in a suit, not a smock. A metal sleeve guards the point like a polite dog guarding a picnic. Yet even here the heart remains the same mineral and clay, the same long class and patience. A lead broken by a hurried click teaches humility. A tin of 0.5 millimeters refills feels like owning a row of very thin rain. Pencils complicate their quiet lives with decoration. There are golf pencils, short and unsentimental, as if you might accidentally play the fifth hole with them. There are souvenir pencils covered in the names of cities that pencils themselves help design. Election day pencils are sometimes tied with string to desks, as if they might escape and vote on their own. Charity pencils refuse to sulk even when sharpeners bite them at bad angles. There are carpenter's blue and dread marking pencils that offer a bilingual line. There are shading sets whose range of gray looks like philosophy turning into weather. Somewhere, someone collects them all, and the drawer opens like a small wooden city. In the privacy of houses, a pencil becomes a domestic spirit. It lives in the kitchen mug with scissors and a ruler that says CM on one side and I remember inches on the other. It makes shopping lists that mention dill because someone watched a cooking video at midnight. It draws treasure maps that bravely locate the couch. It leaves X's beside calendars. On door frames, parents mark a child's height with a vertical whisper that claims, "This is how we know time is not only passing." It is politely standing still for a moment each year. The marks remain after paint, faint as a memory that does not insist but will not leave. Every pencil has two voices, the line it makes going forward and the crumb that lifts when erased. You can hear a life policy in that if you want to. Pencil logic says you commit lightly, adjust frequently, and keep moving. The page is a rehearsal that knows how to applaud itself. Pens are forever. Pencils are for now and for the kind of forever that decides to change its clothes. Even the smell when you sharpen a brave piney ghost explains why woodworkers appear calm. The scent tells you that creation sometimes sounds like tiding. At last, in the gentle bureaucracy of bedtime, a pencil sits near a notebook, just in case a bot applies for citizenship. The notebook shows lines that promise to carry anything without complaint. The pencil points toward morning like a small lighthouse for little ships of ideas. If the thought does not arrive, the pencil is not offended. It will wait. It has been waiting since Borrowdale, since cedars agreed to be jackets, since erasers discovered their taste for modesty. Tomorrow it will make a list, then cross out half of it, then write the rest again a bit neater. The day will go on, slightly improved by hexagons that refuse to rule, by ferrules that shine, by the fact that the graphite on your hand rinses away and the thought remains in the notebook. If you are still awake, breathe like a line being drawn, in for the stroke that begins, out for the stroke that completes. Somewhere a factory's lights are off and the machines doze, their belts slack, their drums clean. Boxes of yellow sleep in stacks like well-behaved hay. Somewhere else, a desk holds a stub so small it pretends to be a pebble. The house is quiet. You might think about the Borrowdale shepherds and how they picked up the first shining rods like river shadows and wondered if the earth had written something. It had. It was only asking for cedar and clay and time and your hand. We can stop here and let the line end without a period, because pencils love a margin and the night is one. You might not expect a spoon the size of a thumb to influence how people discuss weather, tea, and medical doses, but a teaspoon has been quietly shaping conversations for centuries. It is a small ambassador with a silver face, leaving tiny circles in cups and gentle clinks against porcelain. It looks modest on a table, barely taller than a sugar cube, yet it has a very busy passport. It visits kitchens, chemists' shops, sick rooms, and the pockets of waiters who rescue it from saucers. Long before it settled into drawers lined with velvet or flannel, the teaspoon began as a guess about how much is pleasant. It still is really an elegant guess repeated millions of times a day. If you are still awake by the time we reach the official definition of 5 milliliters, you can subscribe out of politeness to the teaspoon, or simply yawn in its direction. The spoon will take either as praise. It has survived worse, including being left in strong tea for an entire afternoon and emerging with a tan. In medieval kitchens, there was no teaspoon, not as an equal citizen with the tablespoon and the ladle. There were spoons, to be sure, and many of them were personal, carried like pens before pens were fussy. They were carved from wood that tasted faintly of rain, or cast in pewter that kept a memory of the fire. Measures were familial. A pinch was your aunt's pinch. A spoon was the spoon within reach. Confectioners used almond spoons and spice spoons that measured with the confidence of experience rather than fractions. When sugar arrived in Europe in stronger, sweeter waves, desserts became laboratories, and spoons multiplied like agreeable rabbits. Somewhere, a cup required half of something, and a smaller companion began appearing, first as a demi-spoon, then as a teaspoon, named for the fashionable leaf that needed stirring, and the leaf's new friend, hot water. Tea taught Europe to whisper. It had to be brewed, which meant waiting, and waiting encouraged the small talk that survives to this day: the weather, the dog, the neighbor's geraniums, the astonishing reliability of the post. The teaspoon stood in as a conductor's baton for this quiet orchestra. It told people when to stir and when to stop, how many lumps to invite, and how to cool gossip with circles that pretended not to listen. The teaspoon's bowl was shaped like a little boat, which is fitting. It crossed oceans in sugar chests and sailed back in the mouths of cups. In portrait paintings of the 18th century, you will sometimes see a teaspoon shining near the saucer, a prop as delicate as a cufflink. It is civilized to stir. It is even more civilized to know when to put the spoon down. Of course, if you ask for the official capacity, things turn suddenly bureaucratic. The modern teaspoon is 5 milliliters. This is not a guess. It is an international treaty signed, in effect, by kitchens. There were debates. Apothecaries had their own measures, drams, and scruples that rattled like coins. Cooks had spoons that looked equal until you nested them and discovered they argued. By the 19th century, cookbooks tried to solve arguments by printing tables, which were earnest but not always synchronized. Some said a teaspoon was a third of a tablespoon, others a fourth. Some insisted you fill it rounded, others level. A philosophical question that has affected more soufflés than political speeches ever did. Then pharmacy demanded precision because children in fever have little interest in charming imprecision. Glassmakers blew measuring spoons with numbers, chemists confirmed the arithmetic, and 5 milliliters began to move quietly through households, wearing a smile. This is not to say teaspoons stopped being themselves. They continued to be mischievous travelers. Teaspoons vanish from drawers as if recruited by a tiny navy. Office kitchens report losses that cannot be explained by gravity alone. A study at a hospital once counted spoons over months and discovered a handsome attrition rate, leading to the conclusion that either teaspoons migrate or they have reproductive habits no one has observed. The likely truth is that they are small, portable, and frequently set down on the exact border between public and private property. A teaspoon left beside a sink belongs to whoever picks it up with intention, and intention is a very soft law. Hotels know teaspoons intimately. The breakfast buffet assigns them complicated duties. Yogurt, jams, honey, little jars of marmalade that blink in the morning light. Teaspoons manage to act both ceremonial and practical, like ushers with strong wrists. The pastries will survive if you use a butter knife to scoop jam, but the room becomes vaguely disappointed. A teaspoon has the right curve for surrendering sweetness. And when the coffee arrives, it becomes a metronome. 1 stir tells you the sugar is decided. 2 stirs are optimism. 3 stirs are the announcement that the day might require marching. The evolution of the handle is a quiet history of fashion. Early teaspoons inherited the pointed rat tail from the larger spoons that thought they were shields. Then the fiddle pattern arrived, rounding shoulders into a shape that felt good under the thumb. Victorian silversmiths competed to engrave vines that pretended to be modest. Monograms curled on the ends like naps taken by initials. The bowl deepened, then thinned, then flared again when people realized a practical matter. The same spoon had to fit both the teacup and the mouth was non-negotiable. Modern flatware sometimes experiments with geometry square bowls, twig handles, but the classic teaspoon remains rounded because lips are not composed of right angles. Recipes have used teaspoons as punctuation. Add 1 teaspoon vanilla, they say, and everyone nods because the amount seems reasonable, even if the vanilla is enthusiastic. Baking powder and baking soda, those 2 reasonable volcanoes, are measured by teaspoons with the caution of handling matches near curtains. A heaping teaspoon is a phrase meaningful only to optimists. A scant teaspoon belongs to the careful. Spices behave like personalities under the bowl. Cinnamon sits up straight. Cumin drifts. Powdered ginger pretends to be snow and then ambush you. Salt is the famous variable. A leveled teaspoon of table salt is more solemn than a teaspoon of sea salt with its flakes like paper boats. In all these cases, the teaspoon does not argue. It serves and offers its small philosophy that accuracy is a conversation between the hand and the memory. Medicine turned the teaspoon into a guardian. Bottles told parents to give 1 teaspoon of the bitter, the pink, the syrup that promised to convince small lungs to act more like bellows and less like whistles. A plastic measuring spoon lived in many bathrooms, surviving without honor near toothpaste and questions. Later, to reduce errors, dosing syringes replaced spoons. They look like toys that prefer numbers. Still, a household teaspoon remains a fallback when storms meet fevers at 2 a.m. You will see a parent hold one like a candle and promise all shall be well. The teaspoon is persuasive. It carries sweetness and instruction in equal measure. In cafes that fancy themselves as small theaters, the teaspoon is a prop. Baristas polish them as if reflecting the foam in them improves the latte art above them. They place a spoon on the saucer, bowl facing away, in a ritual choreography that suggests membership in a guild. The sound of a teaspoon tapping twice on the cup is a signal as recognizable as a doorbell, announcing that sugar has become a decision rather than a possibility. Coffee spoons, slightly shorter, have their own reputation, partly thanks to a poem about measuring out life with them. That poem is not a complaint. It is a way of saying the small is faithful. Collectors will tell you that souvenir teaspoons were once as fervent as postage stamps. Cities minted them by the thousands, each bearing a skyline or a monument in miniature, sometimes with enamel so bright you expected it to taste of fruit. The handles blossomed into ships, eagles, bison, state flowers, a patriotic garden in a drawer. People brought them home from fairs and voyages and displayed them on racks shaped like little staircases. Guests would admire them, and for a moment the spoon escaped the sugar bowl and entered myth. If you think this is excessive, remember that humans also collect rocks, and a teaspoon is at least useful for tea. At table, etiquette assigned the teaspoon a code of manners. It taught that a spoon should not be left in the cup, because someone will lean forward and receive a surprise to the nose. It advised that stirring should not resemble whirlpool engineering. It suggested that removing a tea bag, if such practicalities can be mentioned, should be done with the press. And lift of a spoon against the side, followed by a discreet relocation to the saucer. The teaspoon is patient. It will not trumpet your victory. It will simply wait to be rinsed and return to the world of drawers. The drawer is the teaspoon's town. Inside, ladles are mayors, carving forks are policemen who only direct traffic, knives think they are architects. In one corner, measuring spoons nest like a family that keeps perfect birth records. 1 tablespoon, 1 teaspoon, 1/2, 1/4, sometimes an eighth, like a cheerful cousin who insists on chili powder. The everyday teaspoons relax in a row, impersonating each other so thoroughly that households insist they can tell them apart. Not that one, someone says, reaching past 6 identical spoons to choose the one that feels like Saturday. Objects consent to these illusions because they enjoy being wanted. Factories that make teaspoons practice a quiet ballet. Stainless steel arrives as sheets, stamped into shapes that look like ghosts of fish, then pressed into bowls while the handles are stretched and taught to shine. The steel remembers being flat but chooses to curve. Polishing adds the note of a pale moon. If the spoon is silver, there is another ritual plating, rinsing, inspecting under a light that finds fingerprints like a detective who is never cross. Boxes fill with the muted clink of spoons greeting their neighbors. Somewhere, a line inspector checks that the bowl is shallow enough to behave and deep enough to matter, then nods without ceremony. There are outliers. The grapefruit spoon with its little teeth acts bossy at breakfast. The Dimitas spoon, small as a secret, lives near espresso like a moth near a lamp. The bar spoon learns to measure by spoonfuls that are not milliliters but a language behind the counter. In Scandinavian kitchens, egg spoons made from horn keep the taste of the egg honest. Horn dislikes sulfur less than metal does. Each specialty spoon insists that a teaspoon is wonderful but must accept company. The teaspoon, who is congenial, shrugs and finds another sugar bowl to mind. Teaspoons carry memories even when they carry nothing. A scratched spoon from a great-aunt's service brings the soft authority of Sundays. A cafe spoon stolen absent-mindedly becomes a confession in the cutlery drawer. Its weight a little wrong, its balance complaining that it belongs to a saucer that misspells cappuccino. Wedding spoons engraved with dates, remember cake, and a promise to keep the dishwasher at a reasonable setting. A chipped spoon becomes the one you reach for when you are alone and not aiming for ceremony. The spoon does not resent emotion. It knows it will stir the same sugar. In the age of machines that whir and flash, the teaspoon's job is unchanged. It measures, it stirs, it cools impatience by offering the mind something circular to do. It is a metronome for thoughts. Watch a writer pause, spoon and cup, eyes on a sentence that needs to learn to be quieter. Watch a grandparent mix cough syrup with a patience that makes medicine blink. Watch a child discover that a teaspoon, when placed on the nose, sometimes adheres by magic, which is actually physics pretending to be delightful. In small ways, the spoon runs the household without a title. Standards agencies insist on teaspoons with flat bottoms for medicine, and unprinted lines and measuring spoons that are readable even at dawn. Meanwhile, households maintain their own standards based on the spoon that feels most like the right answer. This tension between science and comfort is ancient and friendly. 5 milliliters is the treaty. About a teaspoon is the local custom. Most of the time, they meet halfway in a cup of tea and shake hands under steam. When night gets quiet and cups turn into small planets of cooling liquid, a teaspoon rests against the saucer with the ease of someone who has done this before. The bowl still smells faintly of sugar and the polite bitterness of tea leaves that believe in themselves. In most kitchens, somewhere, a teaspoon has wandered off to the couch and will be found tomorrow under a book. Another waits in the sink, reflecting a square of window where morning will be. Another hides inside the dishwasher like a stowaway. They do this so we will have tiny, not very important discoveries, which are the right size for mornings. If your eyes are heavy, note simply that the world standardized something small and friendly so that larger things, recipes, doses, familiar stories told over cups could remain relaxed. The teaspoon's curve fits the tongue. Its shine forgives fingerprints. Its measure is exact enough to be trusted and vague enough to be human. We can let it rest now, bowl up like a moon in a saucer sea, handle pointing outward as if toward the next conversation. The room is quiet. The kettle cools. Somewhere a drawer opens a little and closes again because someone, at the last moment, decided they did not need sugar after all. The teaspoon is patient. It will be there in the morning, holding 5 milliliters like a small, steady promise. You might not expect a bent loop of wire to decide how tiny your thoughts look on a desk, but the paperclip has been curating small piles of human ambition for more than a century. It is modest and a little shy, shaped like a question mark that learned to behave, and it takes up so little space that you only notice it when you need one, or when you find a whole colony living in the back corner of a drawer. Office history is a quiet genre full of objects that do their work without applause, and the paperclip is its most reliable character. Under a lamp at the edge of a blotter, beside a lukewarm mug that promises to taste better after one more stir. If you're still awake by the time we reach the official wire gauge numbers, feel free to subscribe gently, as if pressing down a stack of papers with a single finger, or don't. The clip will hold either way. Before the clip, there was the pin. Pins were more exciting than they needed to be, a tiny drama waiting to happen. They left holes like regrets, and sometimes dislodged themselves at inconvenient moments, which is the polite way of saying people bled for their memos. 19th century stationery was a museum of solutions. Straight pins, eyelet punchers, ribbon ties that made documents look like gifts, and brass fasteners that resembled tiny top hats with attitudes. Somewhere between a tidy desk and an impatient mind, clerks began bending wire into loops, discovering that a simple spring could grip paper without puncturing it. The design that won this unannounced competition is the one you know, the gem. Clipped to elongated ovals in a neat embrace, no sharp edges, no demands for attention. It is a design so comfortable that it arrived without a trumpet. Patents tumbled over each other for alternatives. But the gem was produced and sold in Britain without fuss, and unfussy things often win. The beauty of the gem is that it is a verb disguised as a noun. It holds because the wire remembers being straight. When you slide paper between the arcs, the wire resists a little, then settles, and this negotiation is the grip. The geometry is sleepy mathematics. 2 loops create 3 lines of pressure. The tension is shared. The corners of the paper are protected because the wire doesn't bite, it hugs. The clip works backward and forward on the same principle, which means you can put it on wrong, and it still behaves, a kindness most instructions do not extend. In early catalogs, it appeared alongside pencil sharpeners and letter knives, as if it were another small service to civilization, which it is. Factories that make paper clips move wire through a sequence that, if filmed, would look like a ballet where everyone wears gray. Steel arrives as coils, smaller than a garden hose, but with loftier ideas. It is drawn through dies again and again, each die persuading it to become thinner by remembering the next step. Annealing furnaces heat the wire to relax the temper. Straighteners teach it to forget curls. Baits of zinc or nickel encourage it to shine like someone about to be photographed. Then come the benders, a row of cams and pins performing the same quiet trick thousands of times a minute, folding the wire against itself with a rhythm like rain on a roof. The finished clips fall into bins with a sound that is somehow dry and reassuring, like a drawer closing properly. Packages count them by weight because counting by hand would drive a person toward hobbyist stamp collecting. The paperclip has rivals, of course, because offices are laboratories that never truly close. The non-skid clip sprouted little serrations to insist on traction. The owl clip widened into wings. The perfected clip declared itself as such, which was brave. There are triangular clips and butterfly clips and tiny clamps that pretend to be minimalist architecture. Staples, introduced as a more serious promise, will hold a sheath through the geological pressures of a briefcase, but they require removal and leave 2 pricks of memory. Binder clips arrive like small bulldogs and can be used to hang dish towels, conceal chip bags, and pretend at a bohemian curtain rod. The paperclip, by comparison, is content to be moderate. It does not pierce. It does not bite. It enters the conversation and then leaves without scuffing the furniture. Standards creep into this world the way steam creeps into a kitchen, gently but suddenly everywhere. A standard gem clip, the common size, is usually made from wire about 1 millimeter thick, sometimes a touch less. Its length is about 3 centimeters, though manufacturers will call it No 1 because numbering feels official. There is a jumbo size for longer arguments and a half size for flirtations between receipts. Coatings vary. Some clips keep the shine of polished steel. Others receive a bath of nickel for dignity. Still others are dipped in vinyl and emerge in colors that make files look as if they attended school. The colored ones are not strictly necessary, but morale is often a matter of choosing a small cheerful difficulty over a large sensible one. People mislay paper clips with a consistency that borders on ritual. They slide into the hem of the carpet, ride to meetings in cuffs, and migrate to pockets where they become the silverfish of laundry day. An office with 20 employees can purchase a box of 1,000 clips and discover a fortnight later that the species has quietly redistributed itself into conference rooms, under keyboards, and inside the fluorescent tray of the copy machine where no clip has business being. A paper clip found in the hallway is never claimed by name. It is adopted by the next person who spots it, guarded with the satisfaction of finding a coin that has no denomination but sparkling potential. You can tell how long a building has been in use by how many clips wait in the recess behind the elevator buttons. Myths grow around quiet objects because rumors enjoy a backdrop that doesn't argue. During wartime, some people in occupied countries wore paper clips as a discrete symbol of unity. Others adopted different symbols. Memory and legend hold hands and refuse to be separated. The clip looks like solidarity because it is literally two loops holding together, an uncomplicated metaphor that fits on a lapel. In classrooms, it becomes jewelry and chains, which are the first engineering projects most of us complete without being graded. A chain of 100 clips built during a lecture about municipal sewage or the use of the subjunctive will hang like a slender fence and then collapse, happily into a drawer where it will become, over the years, a loose bracelet of flights of attention. A clip's failure is almost always our enthusiasm. Overload it and it bulges. Twist it absently while thinking and it resigns. Run it through a copier and it leaves a delicate tattoo on the glass, at which point someone sighs and remembers that machines are at heart given to melancholy. Yet the very fact that a clip can be unbent and rebent is its salvation. Given a patient thumb, it can return to service. Many have performed other temporary careers, resetting a router, ejecting a stubborn SIM tray, cleaning the lint from a keyboard, pressing a secret button on the back of something that wishes to keep its secrets. The paperclip is the locksmith of small emergencies. It doesn't object. It becomes a tool because Wyatt remembers how to assume new duties without complaining about job descriptions. Cultural cameos are inevitable. A helpful cartoon assistant once lived inside word processors and resembled a paperclip with eyes. An idea that would have been charming if software were as patient as tea. Office art occasionally frames a single clip against a white background, as if starring an extra in a long film and discovering it was the heart of the story. Sculptors have built clips the size of buses and installed them outside business parks, where they look like punctuation for buildings. There is a university library with a clip embossed on its lending slips, a gentle way of promising your book will be gathered back into the stack. Museums collect early boxes with optimistic names and fonts that curl like confident mustaches. A clip appears in photographs as a small glint near the corner of a report, the quietest kind of documentation. Something was given to someone, held together just long enough. At the level of individual fingers, the paperclip is tactile etiquette. You hold it between thumb and forefinger, feel the spring, and decide if the stack means business or is only pretending. It teaches small diplomacy. You can add a page to a clip stack without upsetting the arrangement, or you can slide the clip halfway down the side to gesture that the contents are temporary. If you want to signify affection for a document without commitment, you place the clip at a slight angle, like a wink that knows its place. Clerks once had entire styles of clipping. An accountant who placed the clip at the top center was a classicist. One who preferred the sigh adored the speed of flipping pages like a flipbook. One who used two clips was either cautious or had survived an incident with a breeze. Archivists discuss clips and tones usually reserved for weather forecasts. Metal corrodes, paper endures grudges. A clip that served faithfully for a decade can, in the wrong humidity, leave a sepia ghost on the corner of a letter. Hence the rise of plastic clips and acid-free folders, and the advice to remove metal before the long sleep of storage. An archive's back room, quietly refrigerated, is the spa where documents retire. There technicians grant the papers freedom from their clips with a flourish like removing a ring from a finger that no longer needs it. The liberated clips go into jars and then one suspects into new lives as office supplies again, because even conservators require stationery. On the desk, the box of paper clips is a landscape. Open it and you see a miniature nest, each clip leaning on another, ready to volunteer. Boxes are often sold in quantities of 100 because someone decided that is how many intentions a person should have at once. Some boxes have a clever side window, a small oval that says, "Look, we are still here." The noise of fingers sifting a box is oddly pleasant, a tiny percussion section under a fluorescent hum. When the box is empty, someone saves it for screws, or collects rubber bands, or uses it as a shrine for small things that may be needed again, an act of hope more than logistics. Office etiquette around clips is ancient and charming. Do not steal the one from a colleague's stack and leave the stack scandalized. Do not return a borrowed clip bent into modern art unless you have also returned the report that inspired it. Do not slide a clip onto damp paper because you want to hear a sound you will later regret. Spare clips belong in a little cup, not in the mouth. This rule is older than anyone's grandmother. If a colleague drops a handful, you both kneel, and the laughter is optional, but recommended gravity being a universal equalizer of projects. Not all clips are metal. There are paper clips made of paper, which sounds like a joke until you consider that paper is stronger than it looks and less likely to stain. There are wooden clips that look as if someone misread instructions for clothespins. There are biodegradable clips that promise to depart this world without leaving their calling card in a landfill, because even stationery has begun to consider its longer biography. Yet the steel gem endures. Its curve fits the human story. Simple materials taught to behave, doing enough but not too much. Polite in company, quiet at the end of the day. If you measure a life in polite tasks, the paperclip appears at satisfying intervals. Sealing a birthday card with a quick fastening before the ribbon. Holding receipts that will argue with a monthly budget and lose gracefully. Tidying a stack of recipes printed with enthusiasm. Pinning together drafts of a letter that will sound wiser tomorrow morning. There are grander technologies, but very few can be flipped onto a sheaf with exactly the right click and exactly the right amount of faith. The clip is both temporary and trustworthy. It is the handshake of stationery. Now the room settles. You can hear a stapler resting, a tape dispenser weighing itself down, the whisper of a file drawer that knows its own path. On the desk, a single paperclip leans against a coaster and considers the last assignment of the day. It will fasten 2 pages that belong together only for a while, and that is the point. The clip is excellent at for a while. The wire's 2 loops breathe in slightly, breathe out slightly, and hold. Later, someone will unfasten it with 1 mild tug, and the clip will wait on the table like a patient answer, ready to be asked again. You might not expect a rectangle of stiff paper to choreograph the memory of whole cities, but the index card has been quietly arranging human thought since long before laptops learned to nap. It sits flat, as if practicing humility. It is the color of oatmeal when oatmeal is trying to look professional. You write a line, turn the card, write again, and somehow the smallness of the space makes your ideas behave. A drawer full of them looks like a crowd gathered for a whisper. If you're still awake by the time we reach the standard dimensions, 3 by 5 inches, or 4 by 6 if your thoughts like elbow room, feel free to subscribe in spirit. Imagine tapping a tiny brass label frame that says Subject's Misc. The card is patient. It is in no hurry to be filed. The story begins with scraps and slips and the kind of tidy chaos that minds produce when they trying to be reliable. Scholars in early modern Europe kept commonplace books, albums of quotations and ideas. But these had the structural problem of chronology. Page 47 has a note about fish brine because that is the day the fish brine occurred, not because fish brine belongs next to salt taxes. The trick was to detach the thought from the day. Traders used small billets for orders. Clerks copied names onto separate slips and rearranged them for convenience. Apothecaries kept lists in drawers, not because they love drawers, but because drawers don't forget under the same heading. Carl Linnaeus, a man who could not rest until the world wore labels, used little paper rectangles to sort plants into categories that felt like schools and families. He expected them to be moved, re-ranked, and promoted. Plants did not complain, and neither did the cards. Libraries adopted the slip like a house adopts a cat. Melville Dewey, whose decimal system ambled into the world in the 1870s wearing neat boots, argued that the library would function better if it could search by card rather than by the accidents of shelving. A catalog written in ledger required paging through the past. A catalog written on cards allowed the future to be shuffled into the present with a flick of the wrist. One book earned one card and sometimes more. Titles that began with "the" were gently reprimanded and told to line up under the next word. The Library of Congress, startled into scale by the 20th century, standardized the cards at 3 by 5 inches because drawers liked that size and hands did too. Printers delivered sets by the thousand, and libraries placed them in long wooden cabinets with small brass pulls that glowed with the oil of generations. Children learned that if you slid the rod and lifted a stack, the cards would fan like a paper waterfall, and your sense of power would briefly exceed your reading level. Cardstock has virtues that are not loud. It is just heavy enough to be a page that refuses drama. At around 200 grams per square meter, it maintains a useful stiffness but still flexes politely when you want to slide it under its neighbors. Too thin and it would curl like a leaf. Too thick and your drawer would resent you. The corners are slightly rounded because square corners behave like opinions. Cards often arrive with a faint grain that prefers to bend one way. You can test this by tapping the edge, a trick that makes you look like a person who knows things about stationery. Shaded lines appear on some designs to suggest where thoughts should sit, and there is something comically tender about a piece of paper encouraging you to stay between the rails. The drawer is the stage. A library's catalog used to be an orchestra of drawers, each about the height of a hand, all in a grid that could hypnotize anyone who loved rows. Each drawer glided on tiny runners, the kind of carpentry that believed in sweet friction. Inside, a steel rod ran through the cards like a spine, so they wouldn't jump if startled by gravity. Wooden blocks and brass followers kept the row snug. Labels on the fronts, Burbis, Botbri, looked like crisp invitations. You could open a random drawer and discover that the world had been arranged, alphabetized, and made to balance its checkbook. Dust settled there the way dust settles on time. The sound of a card drawer closing soft, sliding, decisive, was a lullaby for organized people. Indexing required etiquette, and every clerk learned it with the seriousness of a tea ceremony. Write the author in capital letters, give the title in lowercase. Tuck the publication city into parentheses as if you're whispering where the story slept. If the author has 2 initials, do not forget either. If they have 3, do not stage a parade. Use pencil because ink believes in permanence too early. A sharpen now too is the diplomatic instrument of catalogers. The pressure was light, the eraser was gentle. If the book changed editions, a modest second ed appeared like a shy badge. Multiple subjects called for multiple cards. This is how a single novel can generate a family reunion under American fiction, sea stories, and Wales fiction. The more you think about Wales filing under fiction, the more polite the drawer seems. In offices, the card learned phone numbers, serial numbers, and what the weather was doing to the temper of machines. Businesses used rod systems that locked the cards in place so a breeze wouldn't convert a client list into modern confetti. Some companies used visible index systems, cards mounted vertically behind glass so that a clerk could scan a week's schedule in a single wink. The names looked like a miniature skyline. Color tabs began to bloom red for accounts due, blue for accounts that smiled, yellow for accounts that required tea before discussion. When forms asked for occupation, someone wrote indexer, which is a job description that doubles as a personality test. A surprisingly large amount of engineering went into card boxes. Tab dividers wore their letters like collars. Followers slid forward as the drawer emptied, a gentle hand at your back. Some boxes kept their cards with rubber rails, others with metal lips, and one brand offered a tiny latch that made a click you could feel in your molars, a sound that said today was going to go according to plan. There were desktop cradles for recipe cards, that let you dictate a sauce while keeping your hands floury. There were tickler files, one for each day of the month, where you place reminders for your future self, because your future self is always a little more capable if prompted with a square of paper. Standard sizes achieved the bureaucratic dignity of shoe sizes. 3x5 ruled the land, especially North America. 4x6 comforted those who wrote larger or who preferred to include a small diagram of a sandwich. 5x8 were majestic and slightly too big for flirtations. European cards introduced their own metrics because the metric system is confident. The important thing is compatibility with drawers and the human thumb. Try to go rogue with a 4x5 and the world pretends not to see you. The cards enjoy being neighbors. When cards from different systems meet, they tolerate each other like cousins at a reunion, cheerful but assessed. Specialized systems deserve a drowsy tour. McBee Keysert cards, born in the 1930s, arrived with holes along the edges and a set of little notches you could punch with a handheld tool. Each notch stood for a category: blue cars, overdue accounts, enthusiastic octogenarians, anything you liked. Ask a question by inserting knitting needles through the edges and lifting. Cards with the right combination fell out like shy volunteers. It was database logic performed by gravity. The cards made a soft rain on the desk. People used them to track birds and boats and whether customers liked their toast seriously or only in principle. There were also library cards with diagonal cut corners to signal outdated, a small geometry of shame. The vocabulary of filing expanded. Strip, notch, overlay, rod, follower, chat a soft consonant for paper smell. Humidity has opinions about cards. In damp rooms, they curl into gentle smiles. In deserts, they behave like thin boards. Librarians used to measure the weather with their fingers. If the cards protested when you riffled them, the humidity had wandered into drama. Cards absorb odors politely, so a drawer in a seaside town smells faintly of salt and cardboard, which is a scent that could be bottled and sold as administrative breeze. The graphite of pencil text grows glossy under the touch of many searches, producing a patina that historians can read like tree rings. If you drop a stack, the appropriate response is to inhale, accept the new opportunity for humility, and begin again at A. Nobody runs. Running with cards produces tragedy and aerobics. Of course, the computer arrived, bringing databases that live inside humming boxes. Cards retired with grace because paper does not argue with electricity. It waits. Libraries digitized and offered search bars, which replaced the slow thrill of a drawer with the quick thrill of a blinking cursor. Yet even in digital catalogs, the logic of cards remains. Each record is a card wearing pixels. Fields like author, title, and subject are the same old drawers with different handles. Modern software allows tags to multiply like rabbits, which is wonderful until the rabbits want dinner. The card taught restraint, one subject, two at most. The rest will find you later. That lesson still helps on bright screens. There is an art to a single card with a single thought. Scholars who keep slip boxes, sometimes called Zettelkasten because German enjoys tidy compounds, write one idea on one card. The rule sounds obstinate until you try it. A small surface refuses to host two different arguments. It demands you finish a sentence before inviting a friend. The back of the card becomes a balcony for references. Numbers connect cards to cards. The drawer becomes a maze with breadcrumbs that do not attract birds. Writers claim that a box of a few thousand cards hums like a modest city. You can take a walk at dusk by flipping through and choosing a block to visit. Home drawers acquire their own topography. In the kitchen, recipe cards bend at the corner that marks your favorite cake, a little dog ear like a wink across the room. In the workshop, cards track the sizes of screws that live in neighboring jars. There is always one jar with a legend written 20 years ago by a different handwriting yourself, but optimistic. In the hallway, an address file rests beside the phone that now rings mostly for couriers and holidays. The cards remember people who have moved and some who will not. The drawer is a census that confesses the passage of time more gently than calendars do. There is a technique to writing on cards that experienced note-takers practice without noticing. Start at the top with a small heading, never larger than a whisper. Write in lines that breathe. Stop just short of the right edge so that the stack shows a neat column when flipped. Leave a margin at the bottom for the inevitable addition that arrives after tea. Date the card in pencil as if the date were a footnote to a mood. If you must draw an arrow, resist the dramas of calligraphy. A calm arrow persuades where a fancy arrow scolds. When the card is full, do not panic. There will be another. Shuffling is its own small pleasure. The sound is papery rain. The feel is silk that has decided to be honest. A good shuffle resettles your thinking, like rearranging furniture at the level of a mouse. Some people riffle fast, others slowly, stopping to read fragments, wharf light, tin tacks. Ask Mr. P about the vinegar snippets that are as soothing as they are useless outside their stack. You can test whether a day is hectic by how often cards migrate to the left pocket and then return to the right. A very calm day is one where the cards never leave the desk and the desk forgives you. The aesthetic of card cabinets is a style all its own. Honeyed oak, brass pulls with label windows, dovetail joints that look like folded sleeves. Many cabinets were retired to living rooms where they became side tables with an unusual number of opinions. People keep buttons in them now, or herbs, or a collection of charging cables that will never be the right one. Each little drawer promises that inside is a secret worth exactly 3 by 5 inches. It is a comforting lie. The secret inside is mostly air and the possibility that next week you will finally sort the sewing needles. Office mythology suggests that a misplaced card can travel as far as a message in a bottle. A patron once found a library card wedged under a radiator where it had hibernated for 20 winters. The book had been weeping absence in the catalog the entire time. Another card surfaced in a summer house attic, tucked into a mystery novel so that the murderer would always be 2 pages away. These stories are not exactly responsible, but they explain why the followers and drawers are spring-loaded. The world believes in drift. Card systems gently disagree. Teaching with cards is a soft sport. Professors build card storms on their desks before lectures, stacks arranged like little cities. Students watch the professor's fingers walk from stack to stack, pulling a quote, a date, a joke about coal. The joke slips back into place with a smile that only wood pulp understands. Museums still mount exhibitions with cards, artifacts described on tidy rectangles, upright in stands, the way you might comfort a very small painting. The card is the polite bureaucrat of memory. At night, an abandoned office has a particular quiet that only paper can stage. The clock chitters. The plant considers the moon. Somewhere a screen saves energy with the solemnity of a swan. In a drawer, a pack of blank index cards waits under their own weight, like a book dreaming of itself. They are ready for your morning's list. Call the plumber. Return the atlas. Look up the word flange, because it seems friendly. You will write these, perhaps with a pencil that was sharpened yesterday, and for a few gentle hours, the day will be analog. Your tasks will rest in a stack that can be clipped with a paper clip, pocketed, forgotten, and pleasantly rediscovered near dinner. When you cross something off, the sound is quiet but persuasive. There is an endearing irony that the index card, designed to be filed, is happiest when it is not yet filed. On the desk, it is all potential, like a leash without a dog, a train ticket without a destination printed yet. The drawer will accept it eventually, and the label on the front will accept it too, and the cabinet will sigh almost imperceptibly as the row increases by 1. But for a brief time, the card can be anything. A borrowed quote, a grocery list, a map of 3 sentences that you promise to write tomorrow. It is generous with tomorrow. If you listen closely to a full cabinet in a quiet room, you could believe it breathes wood expanding a little, air moving between stacks, cards settling into an agreement they revisit each night. There's no drama here, only the administration of curiosity. The world is large, the card says, but it is also the size of your hand. Write one line, then another. The drawer will keep them safe, alphabetized without judgment, ready for your return whenever that happens, after tea, after a nap. And when you do return, a single rectangle will wait at the front like the first note of a familiar song, and you will slip it free, and everything will be exactly the right size again. You might not expect a wooden sphere that simply falls once a day to organize the schedules of sailors, shopkeepers, and very punctual cats. But for a long, drowsy century, that is exactly what the time bell did. It did not chime, it did not shout. It climbed a short mast, paused like a patient moon, and then, on the agreed second, allowed gravity to do the talking. In harbors from Portsmouth to Cape Town to San Francisco, people set their watches to a gentle plop. Ships adjusted their chronometers, clerks adjusted their lunch, and anyone who missed the drop shrugged and decided it was almost noon anyway. If you're still awake by the time the ball reaches the top, there is a winch involved, and we have time. Feel free to subscribe or just nod imperceptibly as a kind of silent membership. The sphere will not judge. It falls whether noticed or not. Before the ball, time in a busy port behaved like gulls, always present, rarely cooperative, and inclined to disagree with itself. Each clock told its own polite version of truth. The tower near the market favored a generous minute. The private observatory at the edge of town kept a tighter astronomical line. The watch on a captain's wrist added a personality all its own. A ship leaving for a long voyage depended on its marine chronometer to find longitude by comparing the local noon with the time back in a reference city. If the chronometer drifted, the ship wandered. A degree of error turned into 60 miles of wondering where the shoreline had gone. Many vessels solved this by carrying a second chronometer, which made them twice as confident and twice as wrong if both were mistaken in the same charming direction. Astronomers, who spend their evenings with stars and their late mornings with coffee, offered a solution that was visually simple and mechanically sincere. At a set moment, a ball would drop where the harbor could see it. The ball was not mystical. It was a painted wooden frame, often canvassed, sometimes coppered large enough to be seen from decks and quays. Greenwich hoisted one in 1833 on a short mast atop the Royal Observatory. Each day, just before 1 o'clock, the ball rose slowly, a visual yawn against the sky, then waited. At exactly 1 hour, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, the keeper pulled the trigger, and down it came with a soft finality that made even pigeons consider meaning. Captains on the Thames glanced up, adjusted a knob, and felt their charts sigh with relief. It is hard to dramatize such a fall, but people tried. A child seeing it for the first time was allowed to say there in a voice of quiet triumph, because what else could one say to a punctual sphere? The ball's job was to be predictable. It did not moralize, it ritualized. Observatories elsewhere joined in. Boston offered a ball, Sydney added one. The Cape of Good Hope lifted and let go. Each location had a preference for noon, or 12:30, or the Greenwich 1 o'clock signal, which is one of those comfortable human compromises. If everyone cannot have the exact same lunchtime, at least they can have the same falling moment. In some cities, a gun fired at the same instant to help when fog swallowed the view, because fog respects neither astronomy nor appetite. The accompanying bang made dogs reconsider their stance on precision, but the ball remained the star, a large punctuation mark in the open air. Raising the ball each day was its own small choreography. The keeper watched a master clock, the master clock watched the stars, and began to turn the winch. There was a cable, a drum, and a satisfying ratchet sound. The ball climbed to a first position, called the half-mast, a polite warning to all that the big moment was auditioning. Then it rose to the top, where a paw caught it. If the wind bullied the mast, the keeper checked the guy wires. If rain insisted on being popular, the canvas dried later in a room that smelled like a sail loft in patience. The release was electrical in many places. Greenwich used a current to withdraw the catch, but some stations trusted a simple, mechanical trigger because springs are loyal and wires sometimes gossip. When the signal came, the catch withdrew and gravity performed its reliable party trick. Accuracy mattered, but the social life of the ball mattered too. People planned around it. Offices balanced their invoices to the drop. Shopkeepers tuned their window displays. A nearby sandwich seller learned that 10 minutes after the fall, his line would become very purposeful. Buildings acquired little corners angled toward a view of the mast. A laundress, sleeves rolled, could check her sudsy watch from the courtyard and nod. Children made a game of guessing the instant, though the ball is hard to psych out. They're recording stories around some masts, meet you at the rail when the sphere is halfway up. We will walk when it falls, as if time, like the couple, needed a nudge to begin. This whole apparatus leaned on astronomical time, which is both romantic and slow. Every few days, observatory staff watched the transit of stars across the meridian line through small telescopes set into dark rooms. When a star crossed the wire, the observer tapped a telegraph key, marking the exact moment on a chronograph drum. Clocks were nudged to match. This is not exciting to describe, but it pleases the mind to imagine a quiet room, a crisp star, and a hand moving a second hand by a whisper. The time was set traveled by telegraph cable to other stations. An operator at a distant port could receive the tick like a letter with exactly one word on it. The ball would then agree with somebody else's sky, which is a considerate way to run a planet. Reliability did not mean immunity to comedy. Sometimes the ball refused to rise because a gull had decided that today's zenith was personally important. On gusty days, the sphere wobbled in its guide rails, performing a shy dance. The keeper would note the wobble in the log with a comment such as excess wind, descent irregular, which is also an elegant way of describing the human morning. On 2 or 3 famous occasions, the electrical signal failed, and the ball hung undecided while people below quietly experienced the philosophical consequences of a delayed moon. A backup method involved releasing it manually and apologizing to nobody in particular. Ships recorded the moment as off by a few seconds, which at sea is forgiveness. If you want an odd detail to keep awake by accident, consider the paint. The ball had to be dark enough to contrast with daylight, resistant enough to weather, and dull enough to avoid the glare that discouraged precise squinting. Cherished recipes emerged. Some balls were tarred like a boat bottom. Some were painted with a mixture that an old carpenter promised would last past winter. A few received fresh coats for special occasions, which is as festive as a time signal can be. The masts were its own care, iron strapped with timber, the whole structure held by guys that hummed slightly when wind tested their mood. Maintenance was not glamorous. A man with a bucket, a brush, and a conscience makes civilization work. When telegraphy spread inland, cities far from the coast adopted the ritual without seawater nearby. They liked what the ball meant: shared precision, a public minute, a common shrug if things were late. Shops posted signs saying their watches were regulated daily by the time ball, a phrase that reassured customers the way freshly baked reassures customers about bread. Factory whistles aligned. Train conductors glanced at their pocket watches with an expression that said both triumph and resignation. Even people who ignored the ball liked knowing it would fall. You do not need to watch the minute hand to benefit from the hour. In the United States, the Naval Observatory in Washington sent time across the new nation. Western Union passed it along the wires. Railroads followed it and grew straighter. City halls and jewelers' shops advertised the service. San Francisco built a ball on Telegraph Hill that fell at noon and again, by tradition, on New Year's Eve at midnight. You could almost drain a city of sound at that moment and hear a single's soft thud and the sigh of a million hands adjusting buckles. In Sydney, the ball on the heights of Observatory Hill dropped daily above a harbor that pretended to be surprised every time. Cape Town claimed a particular vigorous sphere which, according to one satisfied observer, descended with admirable gravity, as if other balls flirted with levity. Naturally, the ball made some mischief in language. Waiting for the ball to drop became a phrase for a decision that arrives only when it must. This was observed long before it grew a festive hat in New York, where a luminous ball descends on New Year's not to set marine chronometers, but to help people time their cheering. The older, quieter balls watch this with an indulgent look. Like retired teachers observing a lively substitute, the syllabus is similar, the volume is not, the contrast is instructive. One tradition registers the exact second to correct a sextet. The other registers the exact second to begin a hug. Both, in their way, are navigation. There were alternatives, and they made themselves useful. Time guns boomed in fog. Time balls fell in sunlight. Some cities tried time discs, where a large panel slid sideways or flipped because engineers enjoy variety. Rooftop lights flashed in code. Radio soon learned how to say second by second what a ball could only say once, and with it came a parade of beeps that turned the world into an orchestra of synchronized kitchen clocks. But for decades after radio's debut, harbors kept their spheres, ships still came. Sea air still raised a salt fringe on canvas. A captain standing on the bridge of a steamer liked to confirm a dial with his own eyes. Under the mast, a social ecosystem established itself. Street vendors learned the schedule and arranged trays at a pace that ended satisfyingly with mustard. A hatter discovered that customers were more decisive after the drop, as if one tidy finality licensed another. Window cleaners, perched on their professional clouds, found themselves with the best view in town and the worst opportunity to check a pocket watch. So they learned to read the preparatory half-mast in the corner of an eye. In apartments nearby, people watered plants just before noon and said they were putting the ferns on Greenwich time, which is both absurd and perfectly accurate. Cats slept through the whole thing, which is the feline position on nearly all human innovation. Tourists appeared, as tourists do, and asked charming questions. Can we pull the rope? Not today, but thank you. Does the ball ever bounce? No, though your curiosity does. What happens if we clap? Nothing special, but it will make the keeper's day if you do it softly. Where does time go when the ball is down? Into the watch, into the whistle, into the hour. The keeper demonstrated the mechanism to school children with the gravity of a person who drags a whole city by a string once a day. A child is usually impressed by a large object that becomes briefly smaller and then still, which is also how childhood remembers grown-ups. The economics of exactness were not trivial. Insurance companies looked kindly on ships that reset chronometers before departure, as if punctuality could repel storms. Merchants liked to compare delivery times using the same second. Keys scheduled cranes. Newspapers set deadlines that meant the same thing uptown and at the docks. It is hard to invoice a shipment for about Thursday. The ball made Thursday measurable. Even mistakes became clearer, which is one of the quiet benefits of standardization. When you are wrong, at least you know how wrong with a number. A few moments each year asked the ball to perform unusual duties. On days when the astronomers inserted a leap second into the record, an extra heartbeat given to the clocks, so that Earth and time would continue to stroll arm in arm, the station keepers noted it. In a few cases, the drop waited that extra second as if to say, yes, the planet sometimes needs to tie its shoe. On coronations, jubilees, or national days, the ball wore flags, which did not help accuracy but did help photographs. When a new mast was inaugurated, Someone inevitably suggested making the ball square to be modern, and someone else proposed that roundness had enough centuries of experience to keep the job. By the middle of the 20th century, radio, and then telephone lines with tone signals, and then television pips, and then the tiny quartz crystals that sing in watches had largely replaced the visual ritual. Atomic clocks arrived with the confidence of granite that has learned arithmetic. They keep time with the cesium atom's resonant frequency, which is not inherently romantic but is very persuasive. Satellites circled and began to whisper time into the palm of your hand in whatever time zone your airplane forgot to leave. The ball watched from its mast and saw fewer caps tilted in its direction. Some were dismantled, some were preserved. A few still fall daily, precisely, as if merely waiting for the fashion of visible seconds to return. When you see one today, Greenwich continues, Sydney continues. A handful of others keep the habit. You may feel that your day has been filed under order. The ball rises, and suddenly the hour has a handle. You look around and understand that other people see it too. Strangers share the same second and then drift away with the comfortable knowledge that, at least for now, everyone's pocket has agreed about noon. It is a small civic miracle enacted by gravity, rope, paint, and the willingness to look up. If you were to stand under the mast on a quiet weekday and listen, you would hear very little. A gull negotiating with the wind, the click of the catch, the brief rush of air as the ball falls the last foot, and perhaps, if someone nearby has a very old watch, the tiny snick of a crown turning. You might be tempted to applaud gently, the way people sometimes applaud the sun when it remembers to set beautifully. The keeper would accept this with a nod that says both thank you and please remember that tomorrow. At the same minute, the same will happen again. It is a comforting thought that an entire city once took its cue from an object behaving exactly as expected. No heroic sweep, no grand speech, only a sphere, a second, and the shared relief of clocks correcting their posture. The harbor exhales, the offices inhale. Sandwiches disappear on schedule. Somewhere a ship moves out past the breakwater with a chronometer set so neatly that longitude looks less like a mystery and more like a place you can count to. The ball settles at the base of its mast, ready to be raised tomorrow by a patient human hand that does not mind repeating itself. And you, with your own day to arrange, might find that a single dependable motion in the distance has made your minute gentler. The world goes on, the time is kept. The cats return to their nap. You might not expect a rectangle of cardstock, a rubber stamp, and an ink pad the size of a biscuit's tin to arrange the quiet rituals of a city, but for a very long time the library due date card did exactly that. It did not scold, and it rarely congratulated. It waited in its little pocket like a polite oracle and told you, in the authority of purple or blue ink, the day by which you should send the book home again. People say time flies, but on a library card, time lined up in tidy columns and wore sweater. If you're still awake when I get to the part about the difference between water-based and oil-based, stamp inks, and I promise I will get there. Feel free to subscribe or don't. The card will be stamped whether you belong to anything or not. Walk with me into an afternoon library, any decade from the 1890s to the late 20th century. The air smells faintly of paste, linen bindings, pencil shavings, and whatever the last person read on the radiator. A clerk sits at a heavy desk with a date stamp whose numbers are on rubber bands, a tool that looks a bit like a polite knuckle duster for accountants. There is an ink pad with a hinged lid that snaps like an opinion. Readers arrive with their selections and set them down with a hopeful thud, and the clerk whose wrist knows the path better than a goal's. Compass does north opens the back covers, finds the pocket, removes the card, and gives it 3 short taps. Press lift center. The stamp comes down with a rubbery kiss and leaves a small, rectangular immortality, 14 Mar 1952, or perhaps 07 Octon 1978. It is a handshake with the future, firm but friendly. The card itself is an exercise in confidence. At the top, a heading, date due. Below, a ladder of faint lines. Some cards carry rules in tiny letters. A fine will be charged for each day kept over time, which sounds stern until you imagine the fine, usually a few pennies, which is less a punishment than a reminder not to grow too attached. Others list a calendar of closed days, as if Christmas required a formal apology from circulation. In the left margin, a place for the borrower's number. On the back, sometimes, a place for the title and author, in case the card and book, like old friends at a market, become separated by a basket of turnips and need a way to find one another again. Stamping looks simple. It is not complicated, but it is exact. The bands on the stamp must be set to the correct day, month, year. Some stamps use English month abbreviations, some numbers, some stubbornly insist on Roman numerals, which makes October feel like an emperor. If the desk has 2 stamps, one is often preset to the common return period, 2 weeks, 3 sometimes, a month, so the clerk can date the card and the slip in one sequence. Receipt now, return then, a tiny algebra of generosity. When daylight saving begins or ends, the wall clock shifts, but the stamp does not. Dates are immune to time's opinion of sunlight, which is a comforting independence. The ink has a personality. Water-based ink soaks, spreads a little, grows a soft edge like a cloud. Oil-based ink sits on the surface, crisp as a new shirt collar, good for coated cards that would otherwise smear at a watery attempt. Some libraries choose violet, some blue, some a serious black. I once saw a whole card stamped in red, which suggested either extreme danger or a very enthusiastic procurement department. Ink pads must be re-inked, a small ceremony with a bottle, and a caution not to flood the sponge. Over-ink a pad and your dates blur, as if the future has been stirred with a spoon. Under-ink it and the numbers whisper, which is poetic but unclear. Watch the choreography at the desk, and you will see a system that became an art. The clerk opens the book to the back, slides a thumb under the card, checks the last date a little sadly, as if farewells never stop, and holds the card at the top edge between index finger and middle finger. The stamp rests in the other hand like a domesticated animal. The pad sits on the left. The movement from pad to card to pocket is a triangle whose sides are muscle memory. There's very little conversation needed, but there is a great deal of attention given. It is possible to stamp at speed, some do, with the crisp efficiency of a professional xylophonist, but most choose a steady pace, which feels right in a building that negotiates with centuries. If you were to look closely at a card filled with dates, you would see a neat accidental poem of community. Here is late winter in 1964, when someone in gloves borrowed a book about trains. Here's the summer of 1975, when 3 separate people took home the same big biography, and 2 returned it a day early, as if to prove that punctuality can be a hobby. There are sudden gaps, 8 months, when nobody wanted a treatise on Venetian accounting, followed by a little rush in spring, after a teacher assigned the Venetians to a class. On some cards, the dates tilt very slightly upward across the years as the stamp bands stretch and relax. On others, you can tell when a left-handed clerk took a shift because the impression leans west, like a plant moving back toward the window. White grow hooks sometimes hide in the margins, a faint fingerprint of ink, a single hair trapped and preserved under 1931, a corner that smells inexplicably but definitely of oranges. The pocket is humble but heroic. It is a sleeve, usually manila or library buff, pasted to the inside back cover with a particular glue that librarians can identify by nose. Into it go the card and occasionally a slender slip that declares the borrower, S-name like a private handshake, and by 2 weeks signed by Mr. Jenkins, a man who always returns things early and never dog-ears pages. The pocket allows circulation to behave like a conversation book, reader, desk, book again, When pockets fall off, a repair tape with a woven thread grid marched to the rescue, its edges trimmed with a square-nosed knife that looks strange until you see it in action and then seems indispensable, like many tools in a library. What about fines? They were gentle math, mostly. A coin box sat on the counter, pennies whispering, nickels clicking, dimes chiming, quarters being weighed with the seriousness of ship's ballast. Receipts were small and proudly uninteresting. Overdue, 3 days at 2 equals 6. Nobody built a cathedral with that money. They bought more cards, more glue. Sometimes a new cushion for the wooden chair with the one wobbly leg that knows all the secrets. Great controversies did not erupt. The scale of disobedience was measured in coins you might find under the sofa. The due date card kept the scale human. Now we drift into the question of classification numbers gently touching the card world in a parallel lane. At the top of many pockets, a call number sat like a map reference. 636.8 for cats, naturally. 994.5 for Tasmania. 398.2 for folktales. Borrowers sometimes penciled it on the card too, to be safe, because returning a book without its pocket is like returning a friend without their jacket. The call number was not the card's business, strictly speaking, but the two shook hands often, and the handshake smelled faintly of graphite and cotton. Occasionally, a library would print a chart of loan periods on the back of the card. New fiction, 2 weeks. Old fiction, 4. Children's books, 2, which feels unjust until you recall that children read 5 in the time adults read 1, and also forget where they put a great many of them. Periodicals, in library only, a rule designed to be read, sighed at, and obeyed like the stages of grief condensed to the span of a glance. Reference works did not circulate. Their cards remained blank, a peaceful retirement at home. Does the card know stories? It does, but only in the language of repetition. The botany textbook that cycles through September stamps the way the moon cycles through phases. The bird guide that is popular in April and sleeps in December under its dust jacket. The cookbook that wakes up every November with cranberry stains of unknown origin, which the card notices but does not report. The cards become, over time, a geology of interest. Layers of warriors, layers of space race curiosity, layers of a brief municipal enthusiasm for mindfulness that turned into a tranquil row of dates, all in the same month. There were accidents. Once in a while, the stamp fell out of sequence and created an impossible history. Someone returned a book next week before borrowing it today. Clerks corrected with a small X and initialed it, which gave the card a legal air, like a treaty annotated by a reasonable person. Sometimes the ink ran dry mid-impression, and a prudent hand wrote the rest in pencil, carefully matching the font of numbers as if auditioning for a typeface. On very rainy afternoons, a wet sleeve left a watermark on the card that looked like a continent, and staff spent 10 minutes naming the base. There are worse ways to mark a Thursday. You may ask what happened when computers arrived and whispered barcodes into every object. The same thing that happens whenever a polite revolution occurs. The ritual changed its shoes. Libraries adopted machines that beeped cheerfully as a book crossed a scanner. The due date printed on a little thermal slip that curled like a cat and drifted into the book in place of the card. The pockets sometimes stayed, now used for bookmarks, overdue notices, or, in a few rebellious branches, tiny packets of seeds during spring programming because the future of tomatoes also deserves a place to rest. The rubber stamps went into drawers, then displays, then museum exhibitions about everyday precision. I like how many ways the card met human hands. During war years, cards were repurposed when supplies were short. The back of a due date card might carry notes for a knitting pattern, a reminder to buy margarine, or a ration coupon calculation in pencil, softened by time. Children scribbled their names and then erased them to avoid the librarian's steely eye. Teenagers wrote initials in the top corner as a secret attendance record for a friendship conducted mostly in the history aisle. On one famous card I saw, a reader had stamped the book on their own birthday every year for 4 years in a row, as if to prove they existed and to give the book cake in spirit. Of course, librarians notice patterns the way gardeners notice weather. A card with a sudden cluster of identical handwritings meant a class assignment had arrived like a flock. Hold lists formed. Copies flew, peace returned. A card with one date and then a gap of decades was a time capsule. When such a book resurfaced from an attic or a basement, everyone studied both object and card with the fascination usually reserved for meteorites. The fine, calculated at historic rates, would be enormous. The fine waved, calculated at human rates, would be kind. The stamp restored the book to the present, and that evening someone checked it out again because someone always wants the book the universe has been keeping for a while. Small engineering decisions made the card system quietly durable. Cards were sized to sit just below the rim of the pocket so they would not fray. Corners were rounded to dodge snags. The stock was slightly fibrous to hold ink without bleeding into legibility. Manufacturers bragged about archival permanence in catalogs where the adjectives were calm. Pockets were pasted with wheat paste or PVA glue depending on decade and philosophy. A debate about reversibility versus strength could fill an afternoon and sometimes did, along with biscuits. Even the stamp bands had their lore. Some houses kept a tiny bottle of glycerin to keep the rubber supple in winter, a habit learned from bandmasters and adopted by librarians with the same calm urgency. The soundscape is worth noting. A library is not silent, it is politely noisy. The stamp makes a dull, satisfying toke. The pad's lid clicks. The card whispers when slid in and out. Pages turn with a thrum, like a small sail catching a private wind. Somewhere a pencil sharpener makes an optimistic purr. In older buildings, the floorboards add their own opinions. All of this falls below conversation like the subbase of certainty. People who worked with cards for years now report that their sleep sometimes includes a dream of numbers in neat rows and the feeling of a small rectangle agreeing with them. A tiny school of etiquette circled the card. Do not remove it from the pocket unless you are the clerk. Do not write on it without instruction. Do not press the stamp so hard that the numbers emboss the paper. Power is not required to indicate Thursday. Do not lick your finger to separate cards. The future does not need your lunch. If a card is full, file it in the box labeled old cards and slide a new one into place with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for fresh notebooks. There is a serenity in systems that forgive, and the due date card forgave beautifully. Some cards carried technological adventures. In the mid-20th century, a few libraries experimented with photo-charging machines that took a picture of the card next to the borrower's ticket under a small flash. The resulting microfilm could be consulted when mysteries arose. It looked like postage stamps for historians. Later, barcodes added another layer, but barcodes did not argue with cards. They merely provided another way for the book to introduce itself. The card kept the calendar. The code kept the count. Oddities did occur. A patron once returned a cookbook with the due date card carefully wrapped in wax paper, perhaps out of respect for gravy. Another enclosed a note. Please excuse us. The book went on holiday without us, which is exactly how library items wander. A very organized person drew tiny checkboxes next to each date and ticked them, as if the card had passed a test. Someone else wrote, in a tiny script along the side, one new vocabulary word encountered in the text for each loan. You could track their learning without opening the book. The library smiled on this. The card tolerated it. There's one more tiny miracle in the whole business, the way the card harmonized chaos. A library stands at the corner of public and private life. Books leave in coat pockets, under arms, in bicycle baskets, that have carried eggs and flowers, and once, probably, a live frog. They return with crumbs and sunlight and worry and the smell of another home. The card is the handshake that makes the exchange honest without making it rude. It says, yes, you may take this, and yes, you must bring it back, and the interval will be a story only you and the book will know. When the interval is over, the card marks the fact and moves along. If you were to design a device solely to induce sleep, you could do worse than a librarian setting the stamp for tomorrow. It is late afternoon. The stacks are dim in a pleasant way. The last patrons are cautious not to start anything new. On the desk, the bands are turned. Click, click, click. The month advances by the quiet acrobatics of rubber. The pad is closed. The cards for holds are set in order by call number, which feels like arranging a small parade. The clock reaches 5. Somewhere, a cart squeaks a lullaby over a new carpet tile. The lights dim by a notch that is half the sun and half a switch. Tomorrow, the ritual repeats. People will arrive with a book on canaries, a fat atlas, a novel whose hero cannot stop thinking about trains, a pamphlet from 1938 that has survived for reasons unknown and adequate. The stamp will press down with its velvet thud. The ink will dry. The card will carry the date the way a pocket carries a coin, casually, securely, with no drama. It will slide back into its home, a short, precise snap. And somewhere in the middle of the night, when you have forgotten what the day do for your own errands, might be the image of those rows of numbers will drift by like fence posts along a slow road, calm and repetitive, and entirely content to be exactly when they are. You might not expect a single metal bar to have a social life, but the meter once did, and it was an oddly busy one for something that never took a step. In a vault at Sevres, outside Paris, a platinum iridium rod slept in a velvet-lined bed and woke only to be measured by people measuring themselves. Not the people exactly, but their rulers and their rulers' rulers, all quietly agreeing that a nation is easier to run when everyone's millers. Carpenters and astronomers are arguing about the same millimeter. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe so that more facts like the official meter preferred 20 degrees Celsius can tuck you in later, but please don't strain. The meter will be here when you drift back. The idea was simple in the very way that seems to take an empire of surveyors to accomplish. The French Revolution wished to cleanse the clutter of old units feet of kings, femmes of guilds, elves of habit, and replace them with something serene and republican, decimal, universal, helpful to people who liked adding zeros. They gazed up at the earth and decided a meter should be 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole along a meridian, which sounds straightforward until you try to walk it. So 2 patient men, Delumbra and McCain, carried quadrants and circles and notebooks along the arc from Dunkirk to Barcelona, arguing kindly with clouds, mountains, and the occasional mule. The meridian, like most things, was polite at a distance and difficult up close. Wains held their breath at the wrong moments. Church towers trembled. A star blinked when a star should not. McCain, a careful perfectionist in a world that forgave imprecision if it arrived with good wine, discovered an error in his latitude and worried over it like a thread on a sleeve. The story ends without a scandal. The committees averaged wisdom and anxiety, and the meter emerged, proud, slightly approximate, and ready for dinner. A prototype bar first of copper, then of platinum, later of platinum alloyed with iridium so that wear and heat could bother it less, was shaped into an X in cross-section because plain rectangles sag and an official unit should not stoop. The ends were not the measure. 2 fine scratches near the middle were. There is something comically delicate about a world's worth of bridges, tapes, warehouse shelves, and Eiffel Towers depending on the distance between 2 hairline marks that hide from fingerprints. Temperature mattered. 20 degrees Celsius, not 19, not 21. A meter at 19 is a little sulky, a millimeter shorter in spirit than in law. The vault in Sevres kept a steady mood. Hothouse for precision. People imagined a cult. In practice, it was more housekeeping than religion. The bar rested, wrapped like a shy clarinet. Custodians checked the seals. A logbook noted that nothing much had happened again, which is the kind of news standards prefer. Every so often, messengers arrived from other countries, bearing their own national meter bars in padded cases like flutes, and there was a ceremony of comparison. It was not grand. There were no trumpets, no velvet ropes cutting crowds. There was a long table, a pair of microscopes, and a careful person with steady coffee habits. Each visiting bar had twin scratches of its own. The job was to compare them against the mother scratches and record how many millionths of a meter they strayed at the blessed 20 degrees. Imagine a family reunion where the only conversation allowed is, "You are tall by 2 micrometers," and everyone nods as if that is exactly the right amount of love. A bar off by much more than that did not go home in disgrace. It went home with an addendum. Engineers understand that the world tolerates small errors if the errors are consistent and consistently explained, which is a fine motto also for socks and pudding recipes. Travel made the meter worldly. National copies rode trains and steamships. Customs officials asked why someone would hide a sword in Greyfeld. A curator once packed a bar in wool and put it under his seat the entire way from Paris to St. Petersburg, afraid a porter might store it with trunks and forget which trunk. Insurance companies had a rate for meter bars, which is nice because it means you could have filed a claim if yours fell off a pier. Students are told that science is about big ideas, but in practice it often involved a man watching his luggage. In Argentina, a bar toured climate zones to study itself under heat and cold. In Switzerland, a bar was so beloved it acquired a nickname. In the United States, the Office of Weights and Measures, which sounds like a small bureau in the back of a stationery shop, stored its copies in a room that was neither too sunny nor too enthusiastic about drafts. The bars influence architecture in quiet ways. Measuring rooms in standards laboratories had floating floors to shrug off footsteps, and interior columns designed as if the air might be a little heavy with importance. Doors closed softly. Windows faced nowhere dramatic. Thermometers clustered on the walls like cautious birds. The tables supporting the bars were slate, which holds temperature like a polite argument. Lamps were shaded so heat would not crouch over the scratches. People moved slowly, not because slowness was required, but because the repetition of careful acts weaves slowness into you the way long corridors make you whisper. If you walked through such a room at night, you would swear time came here to iron itself. Meanwhile, the world outside was messy and charming. Carpenters' rules bent, steel tapes stretched, ships rolled, factories shook, survey chains caught on shrubs and gossip. The meter tolerated it all. Railways standardized track gauge, not precisely the same story, but a cousin. School children learned that 10 millimeters make a centimeter, and that a centimeter is the side of a little sugar cube. Seamstresses measured hems and confided to friends that the new meter felt shorter than last year's, a domestic relativity. The platinum iridium bar did not refute the parlor complaints. It simply hovered at Sevres with the serene smile of someone who keeps the family recipe and never comments on your cinnamon. Occasionally, there were public moments when precision stepped on stage. In World's Fairs, a glass case displayed a standard meter for the passing parade. People leaned in, fogged the glass with curiosity, and learned that 2 tiny lines were more important than any of the celebrities they had ignored to come look at this. Someone asked if the bar was sharp. "Not in a way that will cut you," a guide said, which is a comforting sentence for all professions. Newspapers ran columns on the romance of exactitude and printed engravings of the meter's cross-section as if it were a fashionable sleeve. Children drew the X shape in copybooks and felt a little possessed of a secret tool. Not every country embraced the meter at once. Britain flirted with metrication like someone who keeps a tea bag in the cup just long enough to consider it and then decides to try again later. The United States adopted the meter officially in a complicated way, like a promise to go to the gym that becomes a sincere friendship with the building, but not the machines. The bar at Severs waited with patience. Patience is a property of alloys not listed on spec sheets. The platinum brought dignity, the iridium brought indifference, and together they minded their business across revolutions, recessions, in a brief period when everyone thought you could solve most problems with larger calibers. A curious thing happens when your perfect object is merely as perfect as metals allow. You begin to dream of something purer. Physicists wanted a definition that would remain the same even if one day the vault at Severs were overtaken by mice, which is not an insult to France or its mice, but a universal worry about vaults. Light proposed itself with the confidence of someone who has been around. In 1960, the meter was redefined in terms of the orange-red light of Krypton 86, a color used by neon signs that wished to appear responsible. The scratches still mattered to carpenters. You cannot outfit a kitchen with a photon. But the standard marched upstairs, from metal to spectrum, and then higher still to speed. In 1983, the meter became the distance light travels in vacuum in 1/299, 792,458 of a second, which is less a measure and more an agreement among beings about the steadiness of a darting universe. The bar became a relic that still did work calibrations last generations, but the throne moved to a number whose expression looks like a train timetable for angels. People expected drama. There wasn't much. Laboratories rearranged apparatus. Researchers printed new posters. Textbooks tried metaphors. The practical world kept the calm rhythm of tape, chalk, and saw. The meter as philosophy may sit with light. The meter as object remained on desks, engraved in rules, strung in steel over roads. If you visited Severs after 1983, the bar was still there, comfortable as ever, like a retired teacher in the front row. Its scratches had not widened. Its cradle had not changed color. Staff still kept the room at 20 degrees. Ritual persists even when doctrine edits itself, which is good to remember when recipes switch to grams and your grandmother does not. There are micro hooks in this quiet history. One is that the bar never actually measured the meter. It represented it. Those two fine scratches were ceremonial ambassadors. Another is that the original meridian measurement, that grand gesture of walking the earth with instruments, was wrong by a modest amount, but correct enough to build a world of railways and wardrobes. A third is that some nations kept end standards for workshop use, robust rods you actually touched with other rods, plus a tea break. And here is a soft punchline. In some libraries, rulers were printed in centimeters on one edge, and inches on the other, which made the bar at Severs, in a way, a peacemaker. Children who grew up with such rulers became diplomats of drawers, negotiating between screws and imperial sizes and shelves in metric centimeters with nothing but patience and a pencil. Museums now display copies of the standard meter in quiet cases. The labels are small because the whole point is smallness. You read that the composition is 90% platinum, 10% iridium, and you think about how those numbers are more sensible than most news. You learn that the bar is supported at 2 equilibrium points marked by little notches, a choice that reduces bending the way you might hold a baguette with 2 hands, so it doesn't droop. You learn that early prototypes were kept in sealed tubes to keep off dust, though dust gets everywhere the same way biographies do. If a child presses their face to the glass and asks whether we can still call it a meter if the power goes out, The docent explains that darkness changes nothing and secretly hopes this question will stay in the child's pocket for years. There is also the matter of the meter's friends, the kilogram and the second. The kilogram had its own metal idol for a long time, the famous cylinder under glass that occasionally lost an atom or two, the way we all do, by accident. The second marched in step with cesium's vibrations and did not apologize. Together they formed a quiet dance of certainty, useful for making bread, bridges, and budget reports. Watching them from the wings, the meter smiled with light. If you stand in a kitchen weighing flour, timing the rise, and measuring the length of a loaf pan with a thumb, a snuckle because the ruler is behind the washing machine, you are participating in a ceremony whose efficients include a bar and severs, a noble gas and a lamp, and the speed of light cruising through nothing. I like to imagine the caretaker is closing the vault at the end of the day. The corridor is cool. Shoes whisper on the stone. Keys turn with that rounded metallic click that belongs more to watches than to doors. The bar rests. Tomorrow it may receive a visitor, a long-forgotten industrial standard retrieved from a shipyard, or a physician's anthropometer from 1910, or a piece of tape whose owner insists it was honest and deserves a hearing. The staff will lay the visitor next to a lab reference, align the scratches under the microscope, and write in a log the difference in parts per million. They might drink coffee with a saucer to catch any drips, because a coffee ring near the meter is not a fable anyone wishes to tell. When you leave the museum, if you visited, street signs tell you distances in meters that are really in light, and curbs are poured to heights that are really in metal, and traffic lanes are painted with strips that were measured with tapes that were measured against sticks that were measured against bars that were compared against a memory of a meridian. This could be dizzying. It isn't. It is soothing, like a well-folded map in a glove compartment you no longer open. You know it is there. You drive just the same. At home, pull a measuring tape from the drawer. It jerks out with that satisfying shy, and the numbers appear in a reliable march. On the back is a belt clip that grabs nothing and everything. The tape is in has a slot so you can hook a nail head and measure by yourself. The tape is humble, but it speaks the language that was decided in mint green rooms by people in quiet shoes. But part of me is fondest of the scratches, the thin, modest marks that turn grandeur into furniture. There is a bedtime feeling to that, the grand meter becoming a friendly centimeter, so a shelf can hold a row of books, each exactly far enough from the next to breathe, and close enough to feel the companionship of paper. If you fall asleep now, the bar will keep watch. It is very good at not moving. It has held the same pose for more than a century, calm as a cat on a windowsill. And if it dreams in tiny increments exactly as long as it takes light to cross a very small and very certain space.